Please join me in welcoming U.S. Representative Mike Pompeo.
Thank you all very much. So the question, Dave, you said we got to catch up with Colorado. If we did, would they know? That's some funny laws on their books these days. Who knows? It's an enormous honor to be here tonight. It's an awful lot of fun for me too. So many old friends. I was involved in the Institute not at its inception, but shortly thereafter, and hope I was able to play some small part at making it the enormously important part of Kansas that it is today. You all do such great work. You all protect liberty at every price, and those of us in elected office benefit enormously from that. A handful of you told me that you saw some protesters out there tonight as you were coming in from MoveOn.org. Although when I asked somebody how many, they said not very many, and maybe the rest of them are at Chipotle looking for Hillary. I don't know. And by the way, you know, I saw a photo. Someone took a picture of one of the signs. It was talking about how, you know, we're here tonight because we're trying to take money from the poor and give it to the rich. If their candidate was here tonight, she would command $200,000 for speaking to your group. This is on me. Look, there's a real danger for me tonight. There's a danger in that I could preach to the choir. And make no mistake, I've been in Congress 4 years. I've served all of those 4 years with President Obama in office, a man who truly does believe in big government. So I can use the amens from my friends. There's no doubt about that. But I want to try tonight to test each of us just a bit. And to challenge all of us to think about how you ultimately achieve the freedom and liberty that you all care so much about, how we do it in Washington, and frankly how if we get Washington to do less of just about everything, we can get Kansas to lead the way for freedom and liberty, making all of our lives better and the lives of our families. You know, it's easy to get stuck in a rut when you become part of government. You take office in a place in history. There's a moment. I began running for office shortly after the Affordable Care Act had been passed and after Dodd-Frank had been passed, and you enter service at this point. It's easy to kind of get stuck in that moment. I was, and this will, if my wife were here tonight, she would confirm this. I was reading a book on a complex scientific matter that had to do with my work on the Intelligence Committee, trying to understand the technology that they were trying to develop as best as a layman possibly can. And I was doing this just a few weeks back at the same time I was preparing my remarks for tonight. And I came across this fellow named Charles Towns. It's a name that I didn't know, and I suspect most of you don't know. He was a relatively unknown physicist working in a lab trying to come up with the next great idea. And he ends up getting a letter from two Nobel Physics Prize winners. And the letter tells Charles, it says, stop what you're doing. The path that you're headed down is the path to ruin. If we change anything, it will upset the apple cart, and we should go down a more consistent, a more traditional path of developing the next great technology in this field. Stop, you're wasting money. And Towns, of course, couldn't stop. Frankly, he needed the money. But what he learned later is that the reason they'd actually asked him to stop is that they needed the money. They were competing for the very same grant that was allowing him to continue his research. His research ultimately led to the creation of the laser, a technology that is in use today across the world in thousands of products, things we don't even know. And yet, had he not stepped out, he was conducting science that was being called crazy and ridiculous and worthless and destined for failure. Had he stopped because someone with a vested interest in an economic vested interest in the continuation of current policy and current thinking, the world would be much the lesser for it today. I see that in Washington, D.C. every single day. We get told all the time, you can't do this, and we've never done it that way, and if you change this, surely you will pull the last bar from the Jenga tower. And yet, you all know that we can do better than that. And when I see good coming in my 4 years, I almost always see the good coming from the states. I see it coming from places that are different than Washington in one fundamental way. And that is that Kansas doesn't have a printing press, thank the Lord. And unfortunately, in Washington, we do. We can continue to run deficits. We can build up a whole pile of debt, at least for a while, and continue to mislead each and every one of you. Every time you ask us for something and we tell you yes, but refuse to also tell you the price tag that accommodates that, it's at best misleading, at the worst a straight up lie. Kansas elected officials don't have that opportunity. There are a few gimmicks, there are a few places that they can go, that they can run and hide, at least for a bit. But in the short run, and in the case of what's going on even here today in Kansas, that short run is pretty short. And it is easy to begin to think that the solution is bigger government. Dave talked about that a lot. I've had a chance just in the last couple weeks to have an experience in a completely uncontrolled setting. I was in the Middle East. I was traveling there with the Central Intelligence Agency. It's always great because you can tell they know you're coming because they're sitting on the shelf as a 2XL flak jacket. It's like, yeah, clearly, that's for me. Most of the places I traveled were completely and wholly devoid of the rule of law. And as a result of that, poverty ran amok. It was everywhere. There was no order. There was no capacity for creative destruction because the fruits of anyone's labor were likely to go to the powers that be and not to the laborer, not to the person who performed the task or held the creativity or invented the solution. In Kansas, we can do so much infinitely better than indeed in pockets in the Middle East. You see they're beginning to get the drift as well. There were a handful of places, small communities, sometimes no bigger than a tribe, that had figured out how to create order and freedom and liberty. And they recognized that even in a place like that, even in a place that has income levels that are a fraction of those in the Western world, that even there you can't begin to tax your way out of the solution. And so I hope all the state legislature here tonight will very seriously consider what Dave proposed. Take a look, not in a green eye shade manner, not in a matter of austerity. Sometimes conservatives get characterized that way. We're the bean counters. We're the guy who's going to take the rug away. We're the one who wants to pull out all the underpinnings. And we want to cause the pain. You'll hear the word austerity described. But what Kansas is facing in terms of a spending problem doesn't begin to approach austerity. We still spend an awful lot of money. Indeed, in Washington, D.C. last year, more revenue was collected than in any year in the history of the United States of America. And yet you will hear folks from all parts of Kansas demand that we continue to increase taxation. We don't need to do it. We can figure out how to spend this money better, wiser, smarter, faster. And if we do, we'll have a solid pillar upon which to build both Kansas and Washington, D.C. You know, there are a couple things you get to do in Washington, D.C. that are actually fun. Not everything, but some things you get to do that are truly fun. I showed up in Washington and ended up on the Energy and Commerce Committee. It has a subcommittee that no one's ever heard of. And testifying before us was an agency that no one had ever heard of, least of all me. It was called, is called the Economic Development Agency. EDA for short. I'd never heard of it, but then there are dozens and dozens and dozens of those. And the gentleman who came to testify before our committee about his budget for the next year was a very nice man. He wanted to spend about $500 million of your money next year. I think the budget request was for $485 million. And he was, the more senior members of the committee were asking him questions. And by the time it got to me, I had figured this thing out. I had never heard of the agency, but I had it figured out in about 30 minutes. The Economic Development Agency takes $500 million to Washington, spends 20% on overhead, and redistributes about $450 million or $400 million to you. It's a New Deal era program. It's been around forever. The gentleman who was testifying said, we have a project. It was a steel mill, a $1.5 billion steel mill that they had provided a grant to in the state of Minnesota. They had provided a grant in the range of $3 million. Some of you are CFOs for your companies. Does anybody think the CFO for that project had any idea that that was part of the proposal? He had no idea. That was found money. The United States government provided $3 million in a $1.5 billion project, and the EDA took credit for 6,000 jobs at a steel mill in Minnesota. So when it got to me, I asked the obvious question. I said, do you really think that you had anything to do with that steel mill being built in Minnesota? And he was a little sheepish and said, we were the key that unlocked the project. It's classic. I shall remember it forever, and I have spent the last 3.5 years trying to get rid of these folks. It's been fun to watch because what you can see is a mad scramble. It is sad to see the lack of success that I've had. I would never do something like this without going to the agency and telling them, hey, my plan is to introduce a bill to eliminate you, to make you go away. And so I did. I called them and said I'd like to come over. They weren't too excited to see me. But they knew I was a skeptic at least. But I went over, and it won't surprise you at all that they had flown in the regional director and the Kansas director to Washington to brief me. To brief me on the projects from the EDA that were going to be grants for the 4th District of Kansas. And oh, by the way, if that's not enough, Mike, there are districts, projects in Johnson County and projects out in Dodge City and projects all across your state. And these are very important projects. And by the way, you should know who it is supports those projects. It took 48 hours for us to be called by every one of those supporters. Private meeting held in a room in Washington, D.C., where we were discussing the merits of this agency. And I ended up being told, Mike, how dare you take this on? The director then flew to Wichita, Kansas. He couldn't have put Wichita on the map 4 months before that. Flew to Wichita, Kansas, held a ribbon cutting and a press conference at a EDA grant location, went to the Wichita Eagle, put a editorial in the Wichita paper, all aimed at a single thing. The very same thing those 2 Nobel physicists were aimed at with respect to Charles Towns. If we can shame the folks who are trying to change the system, it is possible for us to retain our sinecure in perpetuity. And that was his objective. The bad news for him is I'm still there. The good news for him is so is he, or at least so is his agency. I've now offered an amendment twice on the floor of the House of Representatives to eliminate the Economic Development Agency. I cannot tell you, you can go to the records and you can see how many Republicans come to the microphone to defend this New Deal era wealth redistribution program. And it's nothing more than that. And the heck of the deal is in Kansas, we get it. We get that wealth redistribution inevitably leads to wealth destruction. There's always this idea, and elected officials hear this all the time about whether we're going to decide how to allocate the pie or we're going to decide whether to grow the pie. The answer is always simple. For goodness sake, create an economy that grows. Create wealth creation engines that will survive and thrive for decades to come. When you do that, the opportunity for the least amongst us is by far the greatest. And yet they want to take this money to Washington, D.C., and they want it to be distributed not by market allocation methods, but rather by political favor. Which brings me to the next set of discussions. Here in Kansas, we have lots of things that matter to us that the federal government does. And we should just be straight up about it. We like them. Most Kansans like them. There are grants, there are favors, there are tax breaks that benefit us here in Kansas. And each time someone begins to propose tackling them, they run to congressional offices and Senate offices all across Kansas. The one that's before us now is one called the Export-Import Bank. And it had a noble goal. It has now fallen into a place where the good people of Kansas would never tolerate this at the state level. For those of you who don't know, the Export-Import Bank is a federal bank that provides loan guarantees to companies who are trying to sell their products most of the time internationally. I have to tell you that I have people come to my office constantly and tell me, Mike, the federal government should not be involved in the credit markets. Get rid of Dodd-Frank. Take the heavy hand of the federal government out. Don't interfere with market play and risk takers and banks and lending relationships. I then have the biggest businesses in America, and including in Kansas, come and say, but there's this one little thing called the Export-Import Bank. And we think it's incredibly important indeed. We think you have to continue to support it in spite of the fact that it puts you, taxpayers, at enormous risk. They'll tell you that it does not. And this is the story that I want Kansans to understand. Anyone who comes to Washington and asks for something that is non-monetary, if they're not asking for real money, they're asking for a rule or a subsidy or a guarantee that comes in some way other than money will always tell you that it doesn't cost the taxpayers a dime, and indeed it is a worthy investment that returns many, many times over the investment that is going to be made. This bank is the very, very same. They'll say, Mike, it's never lost any money. I remind them that 9 years ago you could have said that about Fannie and Freddie. They'll tell you that these are important deals, deals that are done on a commercial arm's length business, and then I ask them, tell me why no bank in America would guarantee that loan. But the taxpayers will. And there aren't really good answers to that. I am hopeful we will get enormous reform to that institution, to tens of billions of dollars of your own money at risk that could be better spent in places like here in Kansas. I confront it all the time too. I come from the south central part of Kansas. We produce an awful lot of energy down there, energy of all forms. I sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee. I hear from constituents all the time who want to make sure that I understand how it is we can continue to produce affordable energy. I have heard from 19 different energy sources during my short time in Congress, from folks who come with the following story. Mike, if you'll just understand that energy A can be the solution for America for decades to come. And we have it all figured out. And I'll ask them, well, tell me why you're here. And the answer is always, well, because consumers won't buy it. They at least won't purchase it at the price that we can afford to produce it for, plus a reasonable return on the investment that we'll be forced to make to produce it. And whether that is the wind industry or the ethanol industry or, frankly, the historic fossil fuel industries, enough gimmicks from Washington. Return the power back here to the states, to the consumers and the customers, and you will have all the energy you can possibly stand, and you'll have it at a price that you can afford and are willing to pay. It's our biggest businesses that often cause these challenges, and it is sometimes the party that I belong to that is too prepared to listen to them. I want to tell one final story from my time, and sort of the last pillar. We've talked about spending, we've talked about taxes. By the way, the tax data that Dave showed for the state very much reflects what happens at the federal level as well. You can go back from the World War II time period, back to 1945, and you can look at marginal tax rates, the highest marginal tax rate on dollars. And it's gone from as high as in the 70s to as low as in the mid-20s. And no matter what the highest marginal tax rate was, the federal government collected about 18% of GDP. So high rates, low rates, the federal government's take is about the same. You all get why that is. I promise you, my Democrat colleagues back there, that they are confounded. You get it. Behavior changes, right? When your high rate is 70%, you move your income to Australia or Canada, or you take a vacation, right? You do something to avoid this awful taxation. We can collect about 18.5% in revenue. We have been spending at the rate of about 23.5%. Thus, $18 trillion and counting. If you used Senator Tom Coburn's math, it's $243 trillion and counting. That is, anybody run a publicly traded company? Been around one? Ever sign a Sarbanes-Oxley statement? I would not sign one for the federal government. Neither would you. If you did, you'd have to show a balance sheet that had somewhere on the order of $250 trillion on the right-hand side, on the liability side of the balance sheet. Devastatingly challenging. We'll dig our way out, I'm confident. But I want to talk about the last piece that puts this enormous burden. It's non-financial only in the purest sense, and that is the regulatory state. Washington, D.C. can't possibly comprehend what it is that you all do every day. I lived it for just short of 20 years in the manufacturing world. You all in your lives live it every day. I hear about it, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or what OSHA is doing or what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is doing. The list is literally endless. You should know that each of those was put in place by a well-intended person, and with the exception of the Affordable Care Act, almost always with votes from both sides of the political aisle. It was so because often cases they were told a story, and I want to tell you the one that I was presented my first week and a half in office. I had a big company come by that was in the business of producing chickens, roosters. And there's this issue about how much space should a rooster get. You're all saying, what the heck are we talking about that in Washington for? That was my first take too. It turns out this is highly regulated at the federal level. This company wanted to talk about how they had decided that the proper distance in a cage was 13.5 inches, except for brown roosters, which should get 15.5 inches. And if the temperature in the particular climate, well, the list went on. And they were prepared to help us pass legislation that would fix the problem of the size of rooster cages. And it took me about 2 days of work along with my team to figure out what was really going on. The biggest companies in America could absolutely afford to provide that. Their smaller competitors would go away, would vanish. Their economics would essentially fall apart. And so much of America's regulatory scheme today is intended for just that reason. It is not aimed at any true health or safety issue. While I've not spoken to any of the roosters directly, I am confident that the incremental couple inches wasn't going to make a material difference in their lives. And by the way, no one was even pretending that it would. You can't get these kinds of things right at the federal level. Our founders knew that. They understood that things like this, simple sets of rules, simple sets of regulations, ought not to be put in Washington, D.C., but should rather be left to those elected officials that are with you tonight, that are around you, that have taken time out of their day to be with you here tonight, that you see at the grocery store, and that you have intimate contact with, and who represent jurisdictions that can be upset this quickly. And if they don't do the right things, they can be replaced. And someone who conforms to the way you think about the world can be put into office. I know that the folks who are out there creating jobs and doing good service to America understand that deeply. I hope that we in Washington are beginning to get the feel for that. I will say, I have now served just a handful of months where the party that I belong to controlled both chambers of Congress. We will make incremental difference as a result of that. That is, in November, America elected more free market believers than at any time in recent history. But it's not enough. There remains enormous work to do. I will offer my amendment on the Economic Development Administration again this year. I received 75 votes on the floor the first time. Out of what would have been 200 plus Republicans, I received 129 votes the second time. Now that's a pretty good rate of pickup. Somebody do the math. The 218, I am almost home. But I'll get 129 votes again this year. You will have folks who come back to their district and talk about fiscal sanity, but behave like spendthrifts. Throw them out. Throw them out. We need to elect serious-minded leaders who are prepared to do the right thing, because when we do the right thing, America will succeed. It is not about what's taking place in Greece today. You watch what the Greek government is facing and you recognize that there is no good outcome. But put yourself 5 years or 10 years or 20 years down the road when elected officials have said $18 trillion, not so bad. $24 trillion, that's the number that the president's budget said the deficit will be at in a decade. You should know that number is short. $24 trillion will exceed the size of our economy by approximately 20% a decade from now. Greece's total taxes collected will exceed its GDP by far less than that this year. We are into dangerous territory, dangerous places. I am confident that if we can elect the right folks to go to Washington, and you all do your good work here in Kansas, we'll get out of the way and let Kansas elected officials lead the way to lead America back to a place where prosperity again can be talked about and lived and dreamed about. My wife couldn't make it here tonight. She very much had wanted to be here. She always likes to correct the record. She also likes to remind me that sometimes when I speak, I should make sure that Xanax samples are available at the back door for treatment of depression. But I'm not depressed. Someone tonight asked me and said, "Mike, you must be frustrated every day." I'm not frustrated every day. I took this on 4 years ago with the mission of always trying to speak the truth, to talk honestly with the folks that I represent about the things that matter to them. And I have watched now in 4 years, I've watched the American people respond to folks like me, elected officials who are prepared to talk about some of the hard truth, to recognize that if you build the foundation of the nation on a set of pillars that is insufficiently firm and not replicable, that you'll end up in a very, very bad place. I've watched now leaders all across the spectrum in Washington, D.C. Turn their head when some of the hard things came to the fore. I believe we have now entered an era where that is no longer acceptable, and I believe that there are a group of leaders in Washington that are now more prepared than ever to tackle this. It gives me great optimism in the long run. In the short run, we have 640 more days. Might be 639, depends how you want to count today. America will rise again. It will rise because Washington will move to a place where Kansas can once again do the things it knows need to be done. Thank you all so much for being part of the Kansas Policy Institute, to rally around folks like Dave and George and their teams who are doing so many good things for us here in Kansas. It will matter to you, it will matter to your children and to your grandchildren. Thank you for having me here tonight.